Hey sophomores, let's look at our vocab words for Africa in the colonial period. And let's start off with our first one, which is Niger River. If you look here in West Africa, the Niger River is an extremely important river. And it will be really important because on this river, Sunni Ali will, from the city of Gao, be able to take over the Mali Empire. And this will really be the beginning of what's called the Songhai Empire that you'll be reading about. So what you need to know is the Niger River is in West Africa. It was used for transportation, and it was also used by Sunni Ali to take over the Mali Empire in this era. Creole. Creole in this sense is a mixed language. So Creole will be a language that becomes mixed as many Africans come in, especially to the Caribbean and places like Haiti, where they speak French, but it's called a Creole version of French. That means there's some mixing from other languages, from Africa, even English put in there, and some different forms of how words are used. So Creole in this sense would be like a mixed language, especially in the French colonies and the Caribbean, that we'll see mixed with African and other languages at this time. Gullah is a particular language used by many African Americans in the southeast United States, especially in South Carolina. It's primarily the same as English, but there will be some different words, and there will be some different vocabulary that's in Gullah that is used. Now, what's really interesting is Gullah, there are some islands just off of South Carolina where you can still hear the Gullah language used all the way up until this day. So this is a unique language, that a dialect of English that is mixing from African and even French and other languages that came together kind of like Creole. Our next word is Geechee. Geechee is very similar to Gullah. In fact, they're put together often. Geechee, again, is parts of South Carolina and Georgia, where the African-American community there has kept much of their language and culture that came from Africa. It is really an example of synthesis, how cultures can synthesize and can mix, or being syncretic. So again, it's very similar to Gullah. It is a language that is spoken. It's mostly English, but it does still have some elements of African languages in it. Voodoo and Santeria, this was brought up in our last chapter. These are syncretic religions that take a mix of traditional African religions and mix them with Catholicism. They can be found in Haiti and the Caribbean, and they combine elements of, I shouldn't even just say African, indigenous, native, and Catholicism. For example, many of the celebrations that are for the saints go back to celebrations that were earlier given to others in African religions and indigenous religions before that. That's Santeria and Voodoo. Candomblé is a Afro-Brazilian religion which has kept its roots and actually didn't even start until the 1800s in Brazil. And it is a religion that has allowed Afro-Brazilians, or Africans in Brazil, to keep their own traditions and their African mythology and legends alive until this day, even with some language elements. So very similar to Voodoo and Santeria, as it is a syncretic faith that was removed by people who were from Africa and they were enslaved and brought to Brazil, but they were able to keep their religion going. It has about 2 million people who practice it today. Saint-Domingue is part of the island of Hispaniola. This is the island of Hispaniola. Here today we'd have Haiti. Here we'd have the Dominican Republic. Saint-Domingue was the former name of Haiti, which was a French colony that was used for mainly sugar, and many, many millions of African slaves were brought here to harvest sugar. The average life expectancy for these Africans who were enslaved was about 3 years long. That's how harsh the working conditions were there. What will really be a big deal about Saint-Domingue coming up in our next era will be that it will be the place of a slave revolt, as Haiti will become an independent country that will be run by Africans who are the descendants of slaves here in Saint-Domingue. Dahomey is an African kingdom that existed from 1450 to 1750. What this kingdom will be most known for in this era is that they grow stronger and they're able to dominate a lot of their neighbors. And one way in which they are able to do that is they are a group of people who was willing to do business with the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the slave trade. So they were a group that was willing to enslave other Africans and sell them to the Portuguese and Spanish traders. The Oyo was another West African empire that was able to become stronger, like the Homa from 1450 to 1750. And one of the ways they were able to become stronger was again by they were involved in the slave trade that happened. So they were kidnapping other Africans and selling them to the Portuguese and Spanish and other Europeans into slavery. A barracoon was an enclosure where slaves were kept in Africa before they were transferred to the Americas, to the Brazil or Caribbean. So these were where they were captured and held while they were waiting to be sold to European slave traders. And these can be found on the west coast of Africa. Ilha de Gore, I believe I'm saying that right, but I'm probably mispronouncing it. That was an island in West Africa off of the modern-day country of Senegal that was known for holding Africans who were enslaved before they would be shipped off to the Americas, Brazil, or the Caribbean. So this was an island, one of the places that African slaves, the last place they would see in Africa before they would board a ship to go on the Atlantic slave trade across to the Americas. The Atlantic slave trade system, this was the system where basically slaves were taken from West Africa, all over West Africa, and were brought over to Brazil, the Caribbean, all over the Americas, a little bit to Europe, but mostly to the Americas. And they were brought, and where they were brought into slavery for growing sugar, growing tobacco, and other profitable products at this time. It's very important to know that Brazil and the Caribbean get by far the largest numbers of enslaved Africans are brought to those regions. The Caribbean islands and Brazil receive the largest numbers of enslaved Africans at this time. The Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was where Africans were taken, brought in ships and chained, and brought to the Americas. We call it the Middle Passage because this Atlantic slave trade is often also called the triangular trade, where goods and resources were brought from the Americas to Europe. Then they would take products and make them like guns, pots and pans and other finished products were brought to Africa, and they would use those to get slaves and trade them for slaves, and the slaves were brought to the Americas, where they would be forced to, again, grow the products like sugar and tobacco. The Middle Passage was a horrible passage. Millions died on these boats, and it's believed that 10 to 15 million enslaved Africans overall were brought to the Americas in the Middle Passage and the Atlantic trade system. The African diaspora. The Atlantic trade system was responsible for the African diaspora. Diaspora means like spreading. It means basically when people are taken from their homeland and they have to spread and go to many other areas to live. This diaspora was done by force, where Africans were forced to live all over the Americas, and this is why we have African people all over the Americas. There are Afro-Latinos in Brazil and the Caribbean and other areas. There are African Americans brought to the United States, for example. We have large populations. And this diaspora was the spreading out of African people all over the Americas. Our last word is abolition. Abolition means to free, or in this case, abolition means to free the people who were enslaved. It was a movement to end slavery, to free people who had been enslaved at this time. This was Africans who were brought. And this is the first time that slavery was racially based. There was slavery throughout most of world history, but it would be if you lost a battle or if you had committed a crime. For the first time in history of the African slave trade, we see a group of people who are labeled as slaves for their physical appearance because their skin was darker. And abolition means the ending of this form of slavery.